Mark's Saturday morning ritual was sacred. Every weekend, he'd slip on his leather jacket, pull on his worn boots, and spend hours polishing his $6,000 vintage motorcycle, a gleaming relic from the 1970s, passed down from his grandfather. It wasn't just a bike. It was a symbol of family, freedom, and pride. This particular morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting a warm glow on the quiet street of the gated HOA community where Mark lived. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and neighbors strolled with their dogs. Nothing seemed out of place. Mark stepped into his garage, whistling a tune, ready to give his motorcycle the shine it deserved. But as the door rolled up, his heart dropped. The space where his prized bike always stood was empty. No motorcycle, no cover, no sign of a break-in, no shattered glass, no forced locks, just a cold, hollow void. Mark blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. He looked again, slowly turning his head to scan every inch of the garage, as if the bike had vanished into thin air. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Where was it? Then, taped to the wall near the empty spot, was a small folded note. Mark's hands trembled as he unfolded it. It had to go. Karen. His blood ran cold. Karen Miller, the HOA board member known for her no-nonsense attitude and iron grip on the community rules. Why would Karen take his motorcycle? Was it stolen? Had she arranged to sell it? Mark's mind raced with questions and doubts. He'd had disagreements with Karen before, mostly over trivial HOA issues like lawn maintenance or holiday decorations, but never anything this personal. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. Karen, it's Mark. I need to talk to you about the motorcycle. Please call me back. No response. The neighborhood was starting to wake up now. Mark stepped outside, hoping to catch a neighbor who might have seen something. He spotted Mrs. Lopez walking her golden retriever and hurried over. Mrs. Lopez, Mark asked, have you seen my motorcycle? It was in my garage yesterday. She frowned, then lowered her voice. Well, I heard from Diane next door that Karen sold it, said it was left abandoned and was an eyesore. Sold it? Without telling me? Mark's voice cracked. Mrs. Lopez nodded solemnly. Mark felt a surge of anger and confusion. How could Karen just sell his bike? Did she have the right? Was there some HOA rule he didn't know about? He decided to check the HOA community board emails and bylaws immediately. His eyes scanned pages about property maintenance and abandoned vehicles, but nothing about selling a resident's property without consent. His mind spun with possibilities, but one thing was clear. Karen had overstepped, and Mark needed answers. That afternoon, he headed to the HOA office, a modest building where board meetings were held. The receptionist greeted him with a sympathetic smile but warned, Karen is on the board. She's very firm about rules around here. Mark took a deep breath. If Karen had sold his motorcycle, he wasn't just going to let it go. He needed to confront her and find out why she'd crossed a line that could cost him thousands. He walked toward the meeting room, his heart pounded. He felt like he was stepping into a trap, but he was ready to fight for what was his. What Mark didn't know was that Karen was already preparing her defense, a secret justification that would turn the community upside down and drag them both into a legal battle neither expected. Mark's heart still raced as he stepped into the HOA meeting room. The walls, decorated with framed photos of the neighborhood's manicured lawns and festive block parties, now felt cold and oppressive. At the head of the table sat Karen Miller, her expression unreadable behind a pair of sleek glasses. Mark, she said smoothly, standing up. I figured you'd come by sooner or later. Mark's jaw tightened. Karen, I want to know why you sold my motorcycle, without telling me, without any warning. Karen sighed, folding her hands on the polished table. It wasn't personal. The bike was abandoned for months. It was rusting, covered in dust, and in violation of several HOA regulations. Mark shook his head, disbelief burning in his chest. Abandoned? That's nonsense. I've been working overtime, but the bike has been in perfect condition, and it was locked inside my garage. How could you say it was abandoned? Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. From what I've seen, it was a safety hazard and an eyesore. We've had multiple complaints. Complaints? By whom? Mark demanded. No one contacted me, no notice, no chance to fix anything. Karen hesitated, then spoke in a low, clipped tone. The board decided to act. Your bike was a liability. Mark's mind reeled. Liability? What kind of liability justified taking his property and selling it without permission? The implications were staggering. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Mark left the meeting feeling more confused than ever. As he walked back to his car, a neighbor called out from across the street. "Hey, Mark, I saw Karen talking to the guy at the pawn shop down on Main Street yesterday." Mark stopped cold. "A pawn shop?" he echoed. "Yeah," she looked serious. "I think she sold your bike there." That was the moment everything shifted. Mark's suspicion deepened. This wasn't just about protecting the community's appearance. Something else was going on behind the scenes. Maybe Karen had personal reasons for selling his bike, or maybe she was using HOA authority to cover up a private deal. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark started digging. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. He pulled up public records, searching for transactions linked to Karen. And there it was. A series of emails between Karen and a local pawn shop owner, detailing the sale of an item matching the description of Mark's vintage motorcycle. His blood ran cold. One email from Karen read, "The motorcycle was sold as agreed. The community must be kept safe and orderly." Another message from the pawn shop owner simply said, "Payment received. Thanks." Mark felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Karen had arranged to sell his property, without his consent, without even telling the board. Was she profiting from the sale? Or was she hiding something deeper? The more he thought about it, the more questions consumed him. Had Karen manipulated the board to cover her tracks? Were the complaints about his bike even real or fabricated? The next day, Mark visited the pawn shop himself. The owner, a grizzled man named Joe, eyed Mark warily, but confirmed the transaction. "Yep, that bike came through here. Sold it for a few thousand. Karen handled everything. Said the bike was abandoned and the community needed to clean up." Mark's voice hardened. "Did she pay you or did the HOA? Joe shrugged. "Don't ask me. Just took the money and gave me the bike." Mark's stomach churned. The situation was more tangled than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a betrayal of trust, a misuse of power, and now a matter that could escalate beyond HOA walls. Returning home, Mark stared at the empty spot in his garage, the place where the motorcycle once stood. He clenched his fists. Karen had sold his family's legacy without so much as a warning, and now Mark knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this slide quietly. Mark paced back and forth in his living room, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him like a storm cloud. Karen had crossed a line, one that couldn't be ignored. His vintage motorcycle wasn't just a possession. It was a piece of his family's history, a symbol of hard work and memories. And now it was gone. He grabbed his phone and dialed Karen's number again, this time with more determination. "Karen, this is Mark. We need to talk about the motorcycle. I want answers, face to face." The line went to voicemail. No surprise. Mark knew he couldn't wait. He decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, an event that usually meant polite small talk and neighborhood updates. But today, it would be his battleground. The meeting was held in the HOA Community Center, a modest room filled with folding chairs and a long table at the front. Residents trickled in, chatting about gardening tips and the upcoming block party. But Mark's mind was elsewhere, focused, sharp, ready. When Karen arrived, her usual confident stride was in full display. She smiled politely at neighbors, but stiffened when Mark approached. "Karen," he said quietly but firmly, "we need to talk." She raised an eyebrow. "Mark, I'm sure everything was handled properly." "That's not true," Mark shot back. "You sold my motorcycle without my permission, without a single warning, without telling the board. This isn't just about HOA rules. It's theft." Karen's calm facade flickered for a moment, just enough for Mark to catch it. She took a deep breath and said, "I acted in the best interest of the community." "By stealing my property?" Mark's voice grew louder, drawing the attention of the room. The murmurs began. Karen looked around, then addressed the crowd. "We received multiple complaints about the motorcycle being abandoned and unsightly. Safety was at risk. I gave Mark every opportunity to resolve the issue. He ignored us." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Ignored you?" "I never received a single letter or phone call. You sold it without even discussing it with me." "Policies allow the board to act in cases of neglect," Karen insisted. "Your bike was a hazard." "Where's the proof?" Mark challenged. "Where's the documentation of any notices? None of this followed the HOA's own procedures." Karen's jaw tightened. "I did what needed to be done." At that moment, a hand raised from the back. It was Diane, a longtime neighbor who had heard the rumors. "Karen didn't tell the board before selling the bike," Diane said quietly but firmly. "I'm on the board meeting minutes committee. There's no record of this sale. It was a secret." The room fell silent. Karen's confident posture wavered, and Mark sensed a crack in her armor. "I was trying to protect the community from liability," Karen said, her voice quieter. "Sometimes tough decisions have to be made." "Tough decisions don't mean stealing someone's property," Mark shot back. "You abused your power." Karen looked down, then back up with steely resolve. "If you want to challenge this, take it where it belongs. Court." Mark nodded, a fire ignited inside him. This wasn't just about the motorcycle anymore. It was about standing up for his rights, and for every neighbor who trusted the HOA to be fair. As the meeting ended, Mark caught Karen's eye. Neither spoke, but the message was clear. This fight was far from over. Driving home, Mark's mind raced. The betrayal was personal, but he knew he had to be smart. He would gather evidence, find witnesses, and prepare for the battle ahead. One thing was certain. Karen might have sold the motorcycle, but she hadn't sold his determination. Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more beneath. Karen's cold explanation. The casual way she'd sold his vintage motorcycle, his family's legacy, felt less like community service and more like a personal vendetta or, worse, a secret deal. He decided it was time to dig deeper. Late. That evening, under the harsh glare of his kitchen light, Mark combed through his emails, HOA records, and even social media. Every thread, every post, every message connected to Karen. It wasn't long before he stumbled on something troubling. An email thread between Karen and the pawn shop owner on Main Street, the one who had taken his motorcycle. The messages weren't just professional, they hinted at something else. One email from Karen read, confirming the sale. "Please expedite payment. The community must be kept safe and orderly." Another, from the pawn shop owner, said, "Payment processed. Thanks for the referral." Referral? Mark's stomach twisted. Why was Karen referring the sale to someone she knew? Was she profiting personally? The next day, Mark called an old friend from his college days, someone who had experience in legal and real estate matters. Sarah listened intently as Mark laid out the story. The stolen motorcycle, Karen's unilateral sale, and the suspicious emails. "Mark," Sarah said thoughtfully, "this looks like it could be fraud or a serious abuse of authority. If Karen was using her HOA position to make personal gain, you might have a solid case, but you'll need more evidence." Determined, Mark decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. not as a spectator, but as a man ready to confront the truth. When he arrived, the air was thick with tension. Several board members avoided his gaze. Others whispered nervously. Mark knew Karen had allies, but he also sensed cracks forming beneath her carefully constructed image. During the meeting, Karen again insisted she had acted within her authority, emphasizing community safety and responsibility. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the board members, Greg, a usually quiet man, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Karen, I've reviewed the emails you sent to the pawn shop. You never informed the board about the sale before proceeding. That's a violation of our policies." Karen's face hardened. "I was protecting the community from potential lawsuits." Greg shook his head. "And did you disclose to the community that the funds from the sale would not be returned to Mark or the HOA, but kept privately?" A hush fell over the room. Karen's eyes darted away. Mark seized the moment. "So you kept the money?" He asked bluntly. "Sold my motorcycle without my permission and pocketed the cash?" Karen's voice dropped to a whisper. I handled expenses for the HOA's legal fees. This was a necessary action." "Necessary?" Mark scoffed. "You used my property as a piggy bank without telling me. That's theft." The room erupted into murmurs and side conversations. Karen's justification was crumbling, her defense unraveling before the very people she'd sworn to protect. Later that day, Mark sat in his living room, scrolling through texts he'd received from neighbors. Some were supportive, shocked by Karen's behavior. Others were wary, fearful of the power Karen wielded. Mark realized this wasn't just about a bike. It was about power, trust, and the dangerous line between community leadership and personal greed. He clenched his fists. Karen might have sold his motorcycle, but Mark was ready to expose the truth behind her actions, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Mark sat across from his lawyer, Sarah, in a small office cluttered with case files and legal pads. The sunlight filtering through the blinds couldn't warm the chill that had settled in his chest. This wasn't just a battle over a motorcycle anymore. It was a fight for justice, respect, and the principle that no one, especially a trusted HOA board member, could take what wasn't theirs. "Mark," Sarah said, flipping through the documents he'd brought, "the evidence you have is strong. Emails, witness statements, HOA policy violations. We can take this to small claims court." Mark nodded, steeling himself. "I want to do it. Karen sold my motorcycle without any notice, without my permission, and she kept the money." Sarah leaned forward. "We'll file the claim for the motorcycle's value, plus damages for emotional distress and any legal fees you incur." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Mark served Karen with court papers, each step feeling heavier than the last. He watched neighbors' reactions. Some avoided him, others offered quiet words of support. The community was divided, whispers swirling like smoke about the scandal unfolding in their midst. Karen didn't respond publicly at first, but then, a week before the hearing, she dropped a bombshell, an ominous letter warning Mark that pushing forward would be costly and unwise. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline but refused to back down. He'd never imagined the woman who'd once been a neighbor and fellow homeowner could turn into such an adversary. On the morning of the AC hearing, Mark arrived early at the courthouse. The small courtroom buzzed with a low hum of activity, people waiting for their cases, clerks shuffling papers, and the judge reviewing files. Karen entered shortly after, her demeanor calm but guarded. She gave Mark a curt nod, no hint of remorse in her eyes. The judge called the case swiftly. As they took their seats, Mark's heart pounded. This was his chance to tell the story, to lay out the facts and demand justice. Karen spoke first, her voice steady but defensive. "I sold the motorcycle because it was abandoned and posed a risk to the community," she said. "I acted within the HOA's authority to protect the neighborhood." Mark's lawyer responded with evidence. The emails proving Karen never informed the board or Mark. witness statements confirming the lack of prior warnings, and the suspicious money trail suggesting personal gain. The courtroom felt tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. Then, during cross-examination, Sarah asked Karen about the payment. "Did you disclose to the HOA or to Mark where the proceeds from the sale would go?" she pressed. Karen hesitated. "The funds were used to cover HOA legal expenses." Mark's brow furrowed. "Did you have approval to use my property's sale proceeds for that?" "No," Karen admitted reluctantly. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Miller, are you aware that selling a homeowner's property without consent can be considered unlawful?" Karen swallowed hard, her confidence wavering. Mark's lawyer finished with a firm statement. Karen overstepped her authority and breached her fiduciary duty to the community and to Mr. Reynolds. As the hearing concluded, the judge announced that a decision would be made in writing within a week. Mark felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He'd spoken his truth, but the outcome was still uncertain. Outside the courthouse, Karen approached him quietly. "This isn't over," she said with a thin smile. "Think carefully about your next move." Mark met her gaze, unwavering. "I'm ready for whatever comes." As he drove home, Mark's mind was flooded with thoughts. Memories of his grandfather, the countless hours he'd spent caring for, the motorcycle, and the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. But one thing was clear. He wasn't just fighting for a bike. He was fighting to reclaim his dignity, his family's legacy, and to ensure no one else in his community would suffer the same injustice. The courtroom was quieter than before, but the stakes had never been higher. Mark sat beside his lawyer, Sarah clutching the edge of the table as the judge entered. The community had gathered outside, murmurs spreading through the neighborhood about the case's unfolding drama. Everyone wanted to know what would come next. Karen appeared more composed today, though her usual confident spark was subdued. The judge called the session to order and invited new witnesses to testify, unexpected players in this tense drama. First up was Diane, the neighbor who had exposed Karen's secret sale during the HOA meeting. Diane's calm testimony confirmed the lack of board approval and Karen's unilateral action. The judge nodded thoughtfully as Diane detailed her discovery of the undisclosed emails and the pawnshop transaction. Then came Greg, the board member who had challenged Karen's actions. Publicly, he presented HOA policy documents and emails that contradicted Karen's claims of proper procedure. His voice was steady, but Mark could hear the frustration behind every word. The community's trust was fraying. Finally, a surprise witness stepped forward. "Joe, the pawn shop owner." "I sold the motorcycle," Joe admitted, his voice rough but honest. "Karen came to me. She said the bike was abandoned and needed to be gone fast. I didn't ask too many questions. Just took the bike and handed her the cash." The courtroom murmured. Karen's eyes flicked toward Joe, but she said nothing. The cows. Judge turned to Karen, pressing her for answers. "Ms. Miller," the judge said sternly, "did you consult with the board before selling Mr. Reynolds' property? Did you disclose where the proceeds would go?" Karen's composure cracked for a moment. "No, Your Honor. I believed I was protecting the community." Mark's lawyer seized the moment. "Ms. Miller, your duty as a board member was to act transparently and with the community's consent. Instead, you made a personal decision that harmed a fellow homeowner." Karen's defense faltered as more inconsistencies emerged. Emails showed her dismissing community concerns and pushing forward with the sale despite warnings. It became clear she had skirted the rules entirely. But the biggest shock came when Karen's attorney presented an email that complicated the picture: Mark's insurance policy. "Your Honor," Karen's attorney said, "Mr. Reynolds' motorcycle insurance lapsed 6 months ago. This left the HOA vulnerable to liability. Ms. Miller's actions, though extreme, were motivated by risk management." The courtroom gasped. Mark felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. His mind raced back to the insurance renewal notice he hadn't received. He had no idea it had expired. Was this why Karen acted? Was she trying to shield the community from legal exposure, even if it meant crossing the line? The judge called for a brief recess. Outside the courtroom, Mark confronted Karen. "Why? Didn't you tell me about the insurance? About the risk?" he demanded. Karen looked tired. "I wanted to protect everyone, Mark, but I should have handled it differently." Mark felt a flicker of empathy, but knew the damage was done. Back inside, the judge resumed the hearing with renewed focus. "This case is more complicated than it first appeared," the judge said. "The court must weigh the breach of trust against the HOA's potential liability." The tension was palpable. Mark sat silently, the echoes of betrayal mixing with a reluctant understanding of Karen's motives. The judge announced that a decision would be forthcoming, but warned that the ruling might not satisfy either party fully. As Mark left the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The fight for his motorcycle had revealed far more than a lost possession. It had uncovered the fragile balance of power, trust, and responsibility in a close-knit community. And now, everything was on the line. Mark walked out of the courthouse, the weight of uncertainty pressing down harder than ever. The judge's words echoed in his mind. This battle was about trust as much as legality, and the final ruling could go either way. But Mark wasn't ready to back down. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table sifting through emails and messages. One particular message caught his eye, a cryptic note from an anonymous sender. "Karen's not the only one hiding something. Check the HOA's financials carefully. You'll find more than just a bike for sale." His pulse quickened. Could there be more corruption beneath the surface? Was Karen's betrayal part of a bigger scandal? Determined, Mark began digging into the HOA's financial reports, budgets, and expense claims. The documents were dense, filled with jargon and numbers, but something didn't add up. There were unexplained expenses, missing funds, and suspicious reimbursements, all linked to Karen's signature. The deeper Mark dug, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't just selling his motorcycle. She was siphoning money from HOA funds, laundering it through vague community expenses and questionable vendors. Mark's phone buzzed. It was Diane, the neighbor who'd stood by him in the courtroom. "Mark," Diane said, her voice low, "I've heard rumors from other board members. Some are afraid to speak up, but Karen's been using HOA money for personal gain for years. We need proof." That's when Mark knew he needed an insider. The next day, he reached out to Greg, the board member who had already testified against Karen. Greg was hesitant at first, but agreed to meet at a quiet cafe. "I've seen some of the same numbers," Greg admitted, sipping his coffee nervously. "Karen's been covering tracks, forging documents. If you want to take her down, you'll need solid evidence, and I can help." Together, Mark and Greg started piecing together the financial puzzle, cross-referencing bank statements with invoices, spotting forged signatures, and uncovering hidden transactions. The more they uncovered, the darker the picture grew. Karen's actions weren't just reckless, they were criminal. Armed with this new evidence, Mark's confidence surged. This was no longer just about his motorcycle. It was about exposing a web of deceit that threatened the entire community. But Mark also knew this fight would get personal and dangerous. That night, as he returned home, Mark noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The engine idled softly, the driver's face obscured in shadows. When Mark looked again, the SUV had vanished. A chill ran down his spine. Was Karen watching him? Had she sensed his investigation? Mark knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just fighting to reclaim a lost motorcycle anymore. He was battling a corrupt system and those who wanted to keep their secrets buried. He looked at the faded photo of the motorcycle sitting on his kitchen counter. His family's legacy wasn't just metal and rubber. It was about standing up for what was right. And now, Mark was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed again for the judge's final ruling. Word had spread fast. The small community's drama had blossomed into a scandal bigger than anyone anticipated. Reporters even lingered outside the building, cameras trained on the HOA and its now infamous board member. Mark sat quietly, flanked by his lawyer Sarah and Greg, his unexpected ally. Across the room, Karen's expression was unreadable, part defiant, part resigned. The judge entered, carrying a thick folder of documents. The room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence, the judge began, "It is clear that Ms. Miller breached her fiduciary duty by selling Mr. Reynolds' motorcycle without authorization and misappropriating HOA funds." A murmur spread through the crowd. "Therefore," the judge continued, "Ms. Miller is ordered to compensate Mr. Reynolds for the full market value of the motorcycle, plus damages for emotional distress and legal costs. Furthermore, the HOA board is instructed to conduct a full financial audit to ensure transparency moving forward." Karen's face paled. She lowered her eyes. Mark felt a surge of relief and vindication, but it wasn't the end. As the courtroom began to clear, Sarah pulled Mark aside. "There's something else," she whispered. "Your anonymous tip was right. The financial audit uncovered more irregularities. The HOA's treasurer has resigned under suspicion, and there may be others involved." Mark nodded grimly. "This goes deeper than I thought." That evening, as Mark walked home, he noticed his neighbors gathering outside the community center. They looked hopeful but wary, their conversations hushed but full of anticipation. Diane approached him. "We're starting a new HOA election next month. People want change." Mark smiled faintly. "Good. This neighborhood deserves better." Days later, Mark visited the pawn shop, hoping to see his motorcycle. The owner greeted him with a nod. "The bike's in good shape," Joe said. "I kept it safe, just like you asked." Mark thanked him. "I want it back." Joe hesitated, then nodded. "It's yours." Finally, Mark had reclaimed more than just a bike. He'd reclaimed respect, trust, and a community ready to heal. But just as Mark thought the ordeal was over, he received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph of Karen, smiling in front of a brand-new motorcycle. Written on the back was a single line, "You won the battle, but the war isn't over." Mark's heart skipped. Was Karen planning a comeback, or was this a warning? He folded the letter slowly, a wry smile creeping across his face. "Bring it on," he whispered. The vintage motorcycle gleamed in his garage. The past restored, the future uncertain. But one thing was clear. Mark wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a fighter, and this story was far from over.